about his religion. Here's a question that I was puzzling over. The language is Babylonian. And by the way, is there a difference between Babylonian and Akkadian? Because I had heard that...
It's one of the dialects of Akkadian. Akkadian's the overall name, and there's Babylonian and Assyrian are the two main dialects.
Got it. You know what a joy it is to get real answers to questions. I'm floating here. This is just awesome. It's better than the internet, what I have here. I mean, I just have to tell you, this is like a living internet. Having the three of you, it's really a joy. So I'm just curious then. So this giant of a man, and he is. I mean, there's no way around it. This giant of a man, Cyrus, comes into Babylonia, sees a language. Why didn't it occur to him or his wise men, hey, what a great idea, let's write our language? Wasn't that the most logical thing that a person would think encountering written alphabet?
Well, it's unclear exactly when it was invented. The general consensus is it was probably Darius, so around 520, so only about 20 years after Cyrus. There's no good evidence that there were inscriptions in Cyrus's day. The inscriptions that actually are purportedly to be in his name at Pasargadae are thought to have been inscribed by Darius to reinforce his connection with Achaemenes and Cyrus's connection, so that was in a sense validating Darius's claim to the throne.
Is there a Persian alphabet prior to the Arabic letters that we have?
Yes, the old Persian script is invented by Darius in about 520.
So they did get an idea from the Babylonians.
Yes, it's a much simpler script.
I see.
And that is that's how their royal inscriptions of the Achaemenid Empire are in Old Persian script from about 520.
So obviously the Arabic script that was adopted with a few Persian sounds, that is because of the Islamization of Iran. Yeah. So I have one more, and this is in a challenging way, but it's an honest challenge. It's not in order to make up a challenge. One of the things that, of course, Hirad Abdahi writes and spoke of is peace as being one of the great principles of the cylinder and of Cyrus's proclamations. So how do you reconcile his love of peace with conquering more of the world than anybody prior to him in history?
Could I respond to that?
Okay.
Purely on the historical level, without getting into the issue of to what extent this reflects a view of human rights. 99% of what's in the Cyrus Cylinder inscription is not unique to Cyrus. Returning the god statues to the temples, rebuilding the temples, allowing other cultures to worship their own gods. This was standard practice. The Babylonians did it, the Assyrians did it, and claimed much the same things. And and also the text about lifting the burden of the peoples of Babylon. This is what conquerors do. They come in and say, look, I've made it all better. Your lives are so much better than they were under the evil, wicked regime before me. There's one particular part of the Cyrus Cylinder for which there aren't direct analogies in earlier Babylonian and Assyrian inscriptions, and that is the one where he says, he talks about the various gods going back to their cities and to their shrines, and then he says, I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. And the relocation of exiled peoples, we don't have in the Assyrian and Babylonian inscriptions, and that is in a sense the key element of what Cyrus is doing that is somewhat distinctive. So in looking for elements of this that might relate to human rights, I'm afraid on 9 out of 10 of them, if this represents a declaration of human rights for Cyrus, then you could make the same case for Babylonians and Assyrians before him.
And that's very important. And by the way, the proof is that the Israelite tribes that were conquered by the Assyrians are no longer, and the ones that he allowed back after the Babylonian exile are with us and known as Jews. So there's a living testimony to that fact. But I go back to my question, how is he such a peace lover if he's such a conqueror?
I will address your question from my experience, which is international criminal law and humanitarian law. There is not necessarily a contradiction between conquering and claiming to be bringing peace, we do see that today governments go and bomb, get into armed conflicts with other countries. And once there has been either a regime change or a situation change, they bring peace, democracy. What Cyrus I'm not making a full analogy with the current situation, but I'm trying to conceptualize that. So what Cyrus says, whatever the motives, I didn't live then, I don't know, frankly speaking, what he thought. But what happens is that when he says that the inhabitants of Babylon were, in captivity, Marduk called me to come and liberate them. And when we read that also in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, where this time it's Yahweh, Yehovah, who talks to Cyrus and brings him, he's my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasures, etc. It's the same thing. So there is, maybe if there was contradiction then, that could be made parallel with today's contradictions. So
okay, no, I could live with that. So in other words, you really judge conquerors by what they do once they conquer, rather by the fact that they conquered. I mean, that's what kings did in those days for a living, was conquer. And so, no, that's fair.
Yeah. All states that exist today are based somehow at some point on conquest.
So it's what you do once you conquer that tells us your values.
Exactly.
Okay, that's fine. I could live with that.
Just add a little thing to that. Really important, I think. In law, you have two bodies of law. The one that consists of seeing whether attacking a country is legal or illegal, that's called the jus ad bellum. Then there is how you treat people in the context of the conduct of hostilities, and after that, that's called the jus in bello. So yes, it's exactly what you said. You coincide with international law perfectly. What you
Very nice. Thank you. Is that applause for me or for him? Or for Cyrus? It was one of the three of us, but I don't know who. I have a challenge, and I'd like to direct this in this case to the ambassador, because you're a professor of constitutional law and so on, and you all think these through, and all of you can comment. But it is commonplace belief, which I happen to be quite ambivalent about, that that morality progresses inevitably, that there are bumps on the way, like Nazis and communists and so on, or Islamists today, but that basically there is this movement of moral progress. But to be honest, it would seem to me, and if you disagree, please state so, but it would seem to me that it might be fair to say that Iran was much morally higher in the way it was run and governed 2,500 years ago than today. And I will take that applause as being for Cyrus. And anybody else, Ambassador?
Your observation is an interesting one, because in Professor's paper...
Yeah, I guess a little louder again.
In the Professor's paper, you talk about Zoroastrian belief and the progression that was taught within that belief that inevitably we would come to this moment of peace where good would triumph over all evil for eternity. That is the hope for eschatology or endpoint. But I think one of the consequences for many people of belief is that free will is genuinely free, and that is its scary aspect, because that means the choice is also free, and as a result we choose badly in many cases.
So you're not a believer in the inevitability of moral progress?
I don't think there's any 90-day guarantee that.
Right. No.
Yes,
exactly.
And this is especially true when we get in the business of exporting democracy writ large, because we tend to complacently just assume that the democratic choices that will be made are good. Mm-hmm. But of course the history of the world is that there are plenty of democratic choices that turned out to be tyrannical and quite murderous, and we don't need to look very far. So we have an obligation to ask some serious questions about the wisdom that underlies democratic choices, And I thought the professor nicely drew the distinction between the justification for having a military incursion and then the justification for how one treats people in the context of that occupancy. Of course, that's as old as, in a tradition I'm familiar with St. Augustine, who had a lot to say about that, in a just war tradition. And we recently had a debate in the country about certain chemical weapons, and while I heard a lot of things that sounded like moral argument, a great deal of the sources that one could have looked to shape that argument were really omitted.
So there's one agreement on that, and I assume that the 2,500 year thing that I mentioned you would agree with as well, that Iran was better off, as it were, under Cyrus than under the supreme Ayatollahs. So it's a very powerful argument against the progress argument. I might add, in light of what you said, Ambassador, that I have changed, I've made a change. I've been broadcasting 31 years, and I actually have made a very significant change, at least to me. I don't think my listeners drove home going, wow. But for me it was, and that is, I stopped using the term democracy as what America should promote and have used the term liberty, because democracy is amoral and liberty is moral. Since there were, as you pointed out, too many examples of free will and free elections that produced terrible results. Would anyone else like to comment on my question on Iran versus 2,500 years ago, or the inevitability of moral progress, or shall I go on? All right, I'll go on. Very good. Could any of you comment on, was there slavery under Cyrus? And the reason that I ask is that I think the Greeks or Athens is overrated morally. But I think that the West is really Athens and Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the morality, and Athens is the rationality, if you will, and not the morality. But so I'm curious, what was slavery? Because the Greeks were totally at peace with slavery. What about Cyrus?
The simple distinction or duality which we would have between free and enslaved, it wasn't nearly as clear as that. There were various kinds of bondage. You could go into debt, not be able to pay your bills and so on, and therefore be in some form of bondage. As far as we know, there isn't a lot of evidence about this, but all of the ancient cultures of the ancient world had various forms of bondage and obligation which made you in various ways and degrees, and to different degrees, unfree. So it wasn't as if, we can't say that Persia was a culture that was stood apart and they were all individuals were born and lived lives as free individuals.
Okay. Now I have my biggest challenge, and Hirad Hebdahi has confronted it. I don't know if I fully share his conclusion, but to his great credit, as in so much else, he has confronted the question of the absence of theory, as you put it. But let me just put it in a more even grounded term, if I might. The Isaiah in the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, I'm one Jew who likes the term Old Testament. A lot of Jews object to it. I love it because I happen to like the old. I think anything, if it's old and it's last, it's usually pretty good. So I'm totally at peace with that term. But Isaiah says, nation shall not lift sword against nation. That is a moral principle. Marduk told me to let people go back to their homes is not a moral principle. It's a directive, it's a moral directive of a great moral man, but in one circumstance, it is not a statement, Marduk told me that whenever you conquer countries, let people go back to their homes. There's to me, an enormous difference between a generalized moral principle and a specific to a specific moment.
It doesn't explicitly say that Marduk instructed him to allow people to go back. It makes clear that his taking of Babylon was through Marduk's decision that Cyrus was the righteous and appropriate king, and he walked hand in hand with him into Babylon, and so it came into his lap. Cyrus then goes on to say what he did, and one of the things he did was allow people to return to their settlements. Now, you can make the assumption that all of this
Okay.
is with Marduk's endorsement,
So
but that's
even
not
forgetting
explicit.
Marduk, it makes it even less universal if Marduk, who is transcendent, is not the author of this. I, Cyrus, who am a wonderful man, and he is, the man's one of the genuine heroes of history. But I don't know why any of this, just as the gods were localized, so was the morality localized. That's different from a universal moral principle that nation shall not live sword against nation.
You've just used the word universal. If you're referring to what I wrote, I'm not sure I talked about, I used the word universal when talking about
No.
the deeds of Cyrus. I wrote it
Right,
7 years ago,
you-
but I
but
don't think
moral principle, if it's not universal, is irrelevant as
Okay, yeah.
what car you choose to drive.
Well, it's a beginning. The Earth was limited. What Cyrus, as you indicated at the beginning, conquered was quite a big part of the known world, known at least to the Western Asians and the Southeast Europeans, which were the Greeks. So in that sense, I'm not sure one could talk about universality indeed, or in terms of moral principle, but he took what was known, Egypt, the great non-Greek, non-European civilizations, he put them under one mode of government, which for its time encompasses what was known and written, a little bit like the United States of America, like a federation he created, a confederation or a federation. Instead of having a president, it had a king that had satraps under his rule. That's the way I see it. What I could add, because it's linked to this, but also to what was said earlier about religions, one could, and that's in that respect what I wrote, one could consider this as a intuitive form of secularism, but in a reverse manner. It's secularism that is defined in a reverse way. I let everyone go and practice their cults, their beliefs, and I, as the king up at the summit of the pyramid, I don't interfere with the practices of the multitude. So I guarantee the independence, the religious independence of each people of my empire.
And this is the remarkable thing about its parallel to the American experience, because especially on freedom of religion, we have two documents, the Declaration and the Constitution. I'm one of these people that believes you can't understand the Constitution unless you put it in the context of the Declaration. A great Chief Justice once said the Declaration was the promise, the Constitution is the fulfillment. Well, what's in the promise? What's in the promise is a declaration of self-evident truth. Truths that you can't prove, in all likelihood, given the mind of man. Truth that you're not obligated to prove to belong to this republic, but truth you must accept as the first premise of this republic. And what is that truth? That our rights don't come just at the hand of man, they come from a creator, they come from a source beyond. Now, how we understand the creator is going to be 101 different ways and approaches, both within religious traditions and across them. But it is remarkable how close the commentary is to the American experience.
Right, and this is a wonderful thing to. No, what you've all said has been extremely helpful, and it shows. Here is my only question, really, at the bottom line question. All three of you, in each way, has done a great service to history and to all of us to know the greatness of Cyrus. Is that Kurush Kabir? Is that correct? Is that?
Or Kurosh Bozorg.
Right, because I saw out there in Farsi it said Kurush Kabir. Is that correct? Was that? Yeah.
Bozorgin is nicer.
And so that is a very important thing for us to know. It's humbling, and also optimistic. I hate believing that there aren't wonderful human beings in history. It's depressing. I want to know about the ambassador's great uncle, and I want to know about Cyrus the Great. My only question is the one I again stated before this, and I hope I'm not being a nudnik here, but and I'm not being a fan of the Bible by doing this. I'm trying to be intellectually honest, and that is because I'm totally happy if your argument is Western world, don't be arrogant and assume all moral greatness derives from the West. Look at this Cylinder and Cyrus. And my only quibble with that is whether there are moral directives in the Cylinder as there are in either the New Testament or the Old Testament. And I'm using the word whether you do or not. As if it's not universally applicable, then it's irrelevant to a non-Akkadian or a non-Babylonian or a non-Persian. But if nation shall not live sword against nation, or Christ's Beatitudes they are universally applicable. And so that's the difference to me, and that's why we study the Testaments, and that's why we say that the West gave the world these values. It's not an insult to Cyrus. His greatness remains great, but you don't get universal moral directives from the Cylinder, as I understand it, like you do from the Old and New Testament. That's my one challenge.
Is there a difference, Dennis, between universal and categorical and without qualification? Because, I mean, one of the things that we most clearly say with regard to the free exercise of religion is that it is meant to be as free as possible, in the sense that without threatening public order. So that if someone's religion decided that, they would start maiming you or beheading people, and that was the proper way to worship, for the good of the public order, a line would be drawn. So that is not to say that the freedom of religion is not a universalizable freedom. It is to say, however, that it can be qualified in its application.
Right. I love extracting universal principles from the Cylinder. I don't know if they were intended, whereas the intent of the Western Bible was to make them universal. That's the difference that I perceive.
I'm not sure whether the Bible is Western, by the way.
You're right, fair enough.
It was born in West Asia.
Correct. I'm happy to call it West Asian. The West Asian Bible has universal directives.
Yes,
I'll live with that. I don't care where the location. All right, that's fair. I have no problem. I'm sorry, Dr. Putz, did you want to say something on this?
Well, yes, just to comment. I'm not sure that defining universal moral directives was part of the objective of the Cyrus Cylinder. It was, as I said, but was saying before, almost all the elements of it are built out of pre-existing literary and historical tropes that we find in other inscriptions. But there is a unique phenomenon to Cyrus that we see in that one sentence I quoted before.
Yeah, that's huge. It is huge.
And to me, his status within the Jewish community is not surprising, given the edict which allowed them to return. Of course, he's the hero for the Jewish people. To me, the key, if you like, to unlocking what was unique about Cyrus would be a true understanding of why, for the Greeks, who had no reason, in terms of the welfare of their culture or whatever, to thank the Persians for anything, why was it they held him in such great esteem? And we don't know the answer to that, but clearly he was something very different and very special, and was seen as having struck a balance of just wisdom and justice in the way he ruled the empire he achieved, which balanced the interests of the people, their cultural distinctiveness, religious and otherwise, and balance that against most empires' desire to draw as much of the value, the wealth and so on from all of its periphery into its center. And he seems to have struck a balance, and whatever the motive for that was, whether it's philosophical or just the interests of good, wise and sensible statesmanship, he managed to achieve that to a degree no one had before and few have since.
Right.
But going further and understanding the Greek view, that's what I would love to know.
That's fascinating. So let me, I'm supposed to wrap up by 9 o'clock. So the fact that you're so quiet and interested is a good sign. You know, it's nice that I love the fact that something this old rivets our attention. My last column, I have a syndicated column, my last column, it's online, you know, on the internet, you can easily see it, is a defense of the old. The very fact that something is called old-fashioned and it's a pejorative blows my mind. Why is old-fashioned a pejorative? It should be a compliment. If it's old and it's lasted, it's usually pretty good. Anyway, so this is terrific that we're riveted by this. And so I just have one final philosophical question that has plagued me since I was a kid, and I was plagued by things most of my fellow kids were not plagued by. But this is one of the enormous questions, and that is the roots of goodness. I've always been preoccupied with good and evil since I was a child, but unlike most, I was not preoccupied with the evil part. I think evil is easy to understand. I don't understand goodness. I don't understand the ambassador's great uncle. I understand Hitler much better than I understand the ambassador's great uncle, risking his life and indeed being murdered to save people he did not know of a different race, quote unquote race, different religion. I think goodness is a bigger puzzle than evil. But because we have this, I think, silly Western bias that people are basically good, people don't study goodness. It's like we don't study health, we study sickness. But I think that goodness is more of an aberration than evil. I mean real goodness. I don't mean helping an elderly lady cross the street. I mean the goodness of Cyrus, for that matter. So I want to know, is there any way to know, is Cyrus a fluke? Or is Cyrus a creation of something noble in his culture / religion?
Go ahead, please.
I am less, throughout this research that I conducted, and you know my conclusions that you know, I was less interested in Cyrus as a human being. I tend to try not to build idols, than the message that is contained in that cylinder and its smaller version, obviously. And that, for me, was the most important thing. I don't know who he was, what sort of person he was in his private life. Maybe he was not nice to his wife, or wives, by the way. So I don't know. Or what is important to me is what comes out from the proclamation.
By the way, as it happens, we do have reason to believe he was nice to his wife, because when on her deathbed, she said it bothered her much more to leave Cyrus than to leave life. So, of course, for all we know, Cyrus made that up. I mean, you know, anything is possible. You know, I mean, nothing is provable, and you know, and there were no handheld recorders. But I believe the story. But I'm not. It's not that I'm not interested in his private life either. I'm interested to know is in any case. Take the ambassador's great uncle. Was that man a fluke? There were some unbelievably good people born, and that's the way it is? Or was he the product of some religious, theological, philosophical system of goodness? Because if we don't have a philosophical system of goodness that can make good people, we're doomed. We can't rely on a handful of great human beings who will be born inevitably in every culture. So that's why I'm asking. I don't give a hoot about his private life. I'm trying to understand, if whatever religion he did believe in, did that inculcate these beliefs? Or did the Jews and everybody else luck out that a very good man was also the most powerful one of his time? That's what I'm asking.
You know, I think I'd like to make two observations. One is, one should never underestimate the power of evil. And, you know, the biblical passage where the devil takes Christ to the top of the mountain and says, "Oh, I can deliver this." That's a pretty frightening passage. I can deliver every one of these people to you. Just worship me. That is, I think, in my tradition, the greatest admonition that you got to take this seriously. But I think the one thing from my observation, Dennis, you're selling these small acts of kindness away too quickly, because one does find oneself by being of service to others. One does find oneself by lifting up another person's burden. And that does happen a lot. And the fact that my farmer great uncle had a farm near Oshvisum, which became an awful place, and the fact that he knew them, he traded with them, he ate dinners with them, knew their children, gave him the opportunity to act at that moment in time in the same way that everyone else tries to undertake an act of kindness. He doesn't plan his death. Indeed, it was written by one of the survivors, Menachem Katz, Pathways of Hope, reflects on how my uncle, worried about his own family, his own daughters and so forth, if the Nazis were to come. And of course they came, and he was the one to lose his life. But that, he ultimately decided that, the immediate of being part of a community, of having that friendship overwhelmed the risk. And I think when, we're raised as part of a community to understand that, we do it in small ways all our life, and then every now and then a door opens and we're given an opportunity to do something great. And I think we should take
No,
it.
we're in total agreement. I don't belittle little acts of goodness, but when I talk about goodness as opposed to evil we think of as murder, let's say, and that's, I think, appropriate. So on the scale of bad, stealing a pen from your business is wrong, and it's theft, but it's not the same as murder. So too, on the goodness scale, little acts of kindness are wonderful, but not at the dimension of what your great uncle did. And of course, it still raises the greatest question of why he did it, and the great majority of his neighbors, who also had Jewish friends, didn't do it. I don't know that answer. And I have been searching for that answer my whole life, and maybe it isn't answerable. And maybe for each individual there was a different story. But I would love all of them to have said, I risked my life, all those, that minority of unbelievably good people, I did it because, and I would love them to have said, my religion told me to do so. That would be my favorite answer. Oh, good, then maybe we really do have a system to create good people. And that's the Cyrus question to me. That's all I'm asking. It doesn't take away from his greatness, the answer. The answer is simply, maybe we don't know enough of the religion he was steeped in or the culture he was steeped in to know the answer, why he acted like Cyrus and not like Nebuchadnezzar. That's the only question I mean, and there may not be an answer, but I do think it's an important question for us humans to simply reflect on. Does anybody, if you'd like any of you to make a final comment here, I know you have all wonderful questions, forgive me, but we have a time limit, and if I just sifted through all of these, you'd have time for drink and dessert by the time I got through all of them. I know a number of you are curious how it got to England. So before a final comment of anybody, how did it get to England, and who does it belong to?
It belongs to the British Museum. It was found by Hormuzd Rassam, an archaeologist, an Assyrian Christian who worked for the British Museum and worked earlier with Layard, who excavated the Assyrian palaces at Nineveh. And Rassam was working in Babylon as an expedition funded by the British Museum. In 1879, found this cylinder amongst many other tablets and other finds, and it was sent back that year from Babylon to London and almost immediately translated, and the announcement of this historically very important object was made with it later in 1879, and it's been at the British Museum ever since.
somewhere between, as you call it, Babylon and England, it got wounded. Does anybody know how that happened?
No, and we don't know whether it was originally intact and broken by the finders, accidentally or even on purpose. There is a possibility it was done intentionally because the workers were paid bakshish per object. So if you had 5 or 6 fragments of a tablet, you'd get 5 or 6 payments. Whereas if you just had one tablet, you'd get 1 payment. So it may have been, but this is all speculation, may have been intentional. All we know is that when it got to London, it was in pieces.
Right. Is it? Any of you know? Is it missing anything that we might think is significant, or it's?
There's 20 lines missing. We have about
20 lines.
45 lines.
That's a lot.
About another 20 are missing. Yeah.
For all we know, though, anything's possible. It might have been, his thoughts on the latest sports event in Babylon. Why? Who knows? The Babylonian Redskins. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just kidding about that. Any final comments from any of you? No? Well, would you thank, this is a terrific panel. We've had just a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much for joining us for this extraordinary evening. Perhaps our panelists would stay for just a few minutes in case there are some additional questions. We have a gift to give each of our panelists in appreciation for sharing their intellect, their time, and their wonderful sense of humor with us as well, and we hope they will come back again, as we do to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening.